All right, so today we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff. Actually, you sent us a collection of materials about this thing called Project 2025,
Yeah,
and you're interested in how it connects to concerns about Christian neo-fascism,
right.
which is a big question.
Yeah.
We've got excerpts from their 920-page policy document, Mandate for Leadership is what they call it.
Yeah.
Articles about hate groups and changing social attitudes, and even a legal case about the Bible in public schools.
Wow.
It seems like you want to understand not just what Project 2025 wants,
Yeah.
but also the wider context or potential impact.
Exactly. It's not just about their goals, but also about, gauging those potential consequences,
Yeah.
especially in light of these anxieties about Christian neo-fascism that you mentioned.
Right. So maybe we should start by defining what we're talking about here.
Okay.
When we say Christian
Yeah.
neo-fascism, what do we actually mean?
That's a great point to start with. It's a term that you hear a lot these days, but it's important to be precise. So essentially, Christian neo-fascism is the merging of Christian nationalist ideology with elements of fascism.
Okay.
So it's this belief that America is fundamentally a Christian nation and that its laws and institutions should reflect that,
Got it.
often combined with authoritarian tendencies and a rejection of democratic norms.
So it's not just about having strong religious beliefs.
No.
It's about using those beliefs to justify a certain type of government and social order.
Precisely. And that's where these concerns about Project 2025 come in.
Okay.
Now remember, we're just here to analyze the information you've provided,
Of course.
not offer our own opinions.
Right.
But some aspects of Project 2025's vision do raise questions about whether it aligns with some of the hallmarks of Christian neo-fascism.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
What in their 920-page mandate for leadership might raise those red flags?
Well, right off the bat, there's a strong emphasis on restoring power to the American people and defanging the woke culture warriors. And this is language that's often used by populist and nationalist movements, including those with Christian nationalist leanings.
Right.
It taps into the sense that true Americans have been disempowered and their values are under attack.
That definitely echoes some of the rhetoric that we've been hearing in recent years.
Yeah.
This idea that there's an us versus them mentality, and
Yeah.
they are trying to destroy America as we know it.
Exactly. And that kind of rhetoric can be very effective in mobilizing support and justifying radical change. Now, to be fair, Project 2025 doesn't explicitly call for theocracy or the merging of church and state.
Right.
There's always a but. The mandate does repeatedly emphasize the need to restore traditional values and moral leadership. And while that can sound appealing in general,
Yeah.
it becomes a bit concerning when you consider the specific policies they propose
Okay.
in areas like education, social welfare, and even immigration.
So let's break that down a bit.
Oh.
You mentioned education. What kind of changes are they proposing there?
They advocate for a massive shift away from public education towards what they call school choice,
Okay.
heavily promoting private schools and religious institutions. They argue that parents should have the freedom to choose where their children go to school,
Right.
and that this freedom will lead to a more diverse and vibrant education landscape.
But isn't there a risk that this could lead to a more fragmented and unequal system,
Yeah, that's a key concern.
where some children have access to high-quality education and others are left behind?
That's exactly right. And it's worth noting that this push for school choice often goes hand in hand with efforts to reduce funding for public schools, which would disproportionately harm low-income communities and minority students.
And how does this tie back into the concerns about Christian neo-fascism?
Well, one of the hallmarks of Christian nationalism is this idea that America's public institutions, including schools,
Right.
should be infused with Christian values. So this push for school choice could be seen as a way to subtly shift the balance towards a more explicitly Christian-influenced education system.
It's almost like they're trying to create a parallel society based on their own worldview.
That's an interesting way to put it. And, it's worth remembering that you also sent us an article from the ACLU about legal challenges regarding the Bible in public schools.
Great.
This highlights the ongoing tension surrounding the role of religion in education and how blurred those lines between church and state can become.
Right. That document reminds us that this isn't just an abstract debate.
Mm-hmm.
It has real-world consequences for students,
Yeah.
for teachers,
Yeah.
and for communities.
Absolutely. And it speaks to those anxieties you mentioned about Christian neo-fascism potentially eroding the separation of church and state, which is a cornerstone of American democracy.
Okay, so we've got this potentially troubling connection between Project 2025's education proposals and the broader concerns about Christian neo-fascism.
Yeah.
But what about those other areas you mentioned?
Right.
It's like social welfare and immigration.
Right.
How do those fit into the picture?
Well, in both of those areas, we see Project 2025 advocating for significant reductions in the role of government,
Okay.
with a particular focus on dismantling what they call the welfare state and cracking down on illegal immigration.
Okay.
They argue that these programs foster dependency and undermine individual responsibility.
Okay, so less government intervention and more individual responsibility.
Yeah.
That sounds like a fairly standard conservative argument.
It does. It's the framing and the language they use that raises these red flags. They repeatedly paint this picture of America under siege
Okay.
by forces that are eroding traditional values and undermining its Christian identity.
Okay.
Immigrants are often portrayed as a threat to national security and cultural cohesion, and social welfare programs are cast as enabling laziness and moral decay.
So they're tapping into a sense of fear and anxiety about the changing demographics and cultural landscape of America.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's a very powerful tool for mobilizing support and justifying radical change.
Right.
When you combine that kind of rhetoric with a push to shrink the government and empower religious institutions, it starts to look a lot like the blueprint for a Christian neo-fascist state.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy accusation.
Yeah.
But you're right, when you connect those dots, it does raise some serious questions.
And it's important to remember we're just scratching the surface here. Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership is a massive document.
Yeah, it's 920 pages.
And it outlines plans for reshaping virtually every aspect of the American government, from the Department of Justice to the Environmental Protection Agency.
So this isn't just about tinkering around the edges.
No.
They're talking about a fundamental transformation of the American system.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to understand not just what they're proposing,
Yeah.
but also the underlying ideology and the potential consequences of their vision.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of consequences, you also mentioned that we have some articles about the rise of hate groups and changing social attitudes.
Right.
How do those pieces fit into the puzzle?
They provide some crucial context, I think, for understanding the environment in which Project 2025 is emerging. One article, for example, documents a surge in hate groups, fueled in part by anti-immigrant rhetoric and anxieties about the loss of traditional values. These are themes that echo very strongly in Project 2025's messaging.
So it's not just a theoretical exercise.
Right.
It's happening in the real world right now. People are being targeted and harmed based on these ideas.
Exactly. And another article you provided highlights research suggesting that the rise of populism and nationalism, particularly during the Trump era, may have contributed to an increase in prejudice and intolerance.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
It suggests that this kind of rhetoric can have a real impact on people's attitudes and behaviors.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these trends.
Yeah.
And to understand how they might be connected to initiatives like Project 2025.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here.
Yeah.
We've got this ambitious plan to reshape the American government.
Yeah.
And we've got these anxieties about the rise of Christian neo-fascism and the potential for increased hate and intolerance.
Right.
But what does it all mean?
Right.
What are the potential consequences if Project 2025 succeeds in achieving its goals?
Yeah.
And how can we as informed citizens respond to these challenges?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and they're exactly what we need to explore next. Let's dive into the potential impact of Project 2025 on specific government agencies and policies and see how those changes might ripple through American society. Picking up on those potential consequences, let's look at what Project 2025 has in store for the Department of Justice.
Okay.
You know, if they're aiming for such sweeping change, the Justice Department's going to be a key lever.
Yeah, you're right. The Justice Department is really at the heart of how laws are enforced and interpreted.
Exactly.
So how does Project 2025 envision using it?
Well, their plan calls for a much more aggressive approach to what they see as threats to public safety and national security, with a heavy focus on two things: immigration enforcement and combating what they call woke culture warriors.
Those terms are pretty loaded, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
It seems like they're trying to create this narrative of a society under attack, both from within and from outside forces.
Exactly. And that kind of rhetoric can be incredibly effective in justifying a crackdown on dissent and opposition. You know, they're essentially saying that anyone who doesn't align with their vision of America is a threat to the nation's well-being.
So it's not just about enforcing the law.
Right.
It's about using the law as a tool to silence and marginalize those who hold different views.
That's a key concern. And when you combine that with their emphasis on, traditional values
Uh-huh.
and their desire to elevate the role of religion in public life, it starts to paint a pretty unsettling picture.
It sounds like they're trying to create a climate of fear and conformity, where anyone who challenges the dominant ideology is labeled as an enemy of the state.
And that's where the connection to Christian neo-fascism becomes really clear.
Okay.
One of the hallmarks of fascist regimes is the suppression of dissent
Right.
and the creation of a single unified national identity based on a particular ideology.
In this case, that ideology would be based on a very specific interpretation of Christianity.
Exactly. They might not be explicitly calling for theocracy,
Uh-huh.
but their vision seems to leave very little room for pluralism or diversity of thought.
It's chilling to think about, and it makes me wonder what would happen to those who don't fit into this narrow definition of what it means to be an American?
That's a crucial question, and it's one that we need to keep asking as we delve deeper into Project 2025's proposals. Remember, you also sent some articles about the rise of hate groups and the increasing polarization of American society.
Right. And those articles suggested that this kind of rhetoric can have real-world consequences, leading to violence and discrimination against marginalized groups.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to understand how Project 2025's vision might exacerbate those trends and create an even more hostile environment for those who don't conform to their narrow worldview.
Okay, so we've got this potentially dangerous connection between Project 2025's vision for the Justice Department and the broader anxieties about Christian neo-fascism and the rise of hate and intolerance.
Right.
But they're not just focused on the Justice Department, right? They have plans for other agencies as well.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that their vision is remarkably comprehensive. They aim to reshape virtually every aspect of the American government, from education and social welfare to energy and environmental policy.
So it's not just about changing a few laws or policies. It's about fundamentally altering the relationship between the government and the people.
Precisely. And that's what makes Project 2025 so potentially transformative and so potentially dangerous.
Okay, so let's dig into some of those other agencies. You mentioned energy and environmental policy. What's their stance on those issues?
Well, their approach to energy is particularly interesting
Okay.
because it reveals a lot about their worldview and their priorities. They're staunch advocates for what they call energy dominance, with a strong emphasis on fossil fuels and a rejection of what they consider to be radical environmentalism.
So they're basically doubling down on the idea that America should be energy independent, even if it means prioritizing fossil fuels over renewable sources.
Exactly. And they frame this not just as an economic issue,
Hmm.
but as a matter of national security and even moral superiority. They argue that America has been weakened by its dependence on foreign energy sources and that embracing renewable energy is a form of capitulation to a globalist agenda.
It sounds like they're tapping into that same sense of fear and resentment that we talked about earlier, this idea that America is under attack and that we need to assert our dominance in every sphere, including energy.
That's a key insight. And it's worth noting that this rhetoric aligns with some of the core tenets of Christian nationalism,
Okay.
which often emphasizes the idea of American exceptionalism and a divinely ordained mission to lead the world.
It's almost like they believe that God has chosen America to be a shining beacon of energy independence, fueled by our abundant fossil fuel reserves.
That's a provocative way to put it.
Yeah.
But it does capture the essence of their worldview, and it's important to remember that this vision has real-world consequences, particularly for the environment and for the fight against climate change.
Right, and it's not just about climate change. Their energy policies could also have a significant impact on public health, air and water quality, and even the economy.
Absolutely, and those are all issues that we need to consider carefully as we evaluate the potential impact of Project 2025.
Okay, so we've got a sense of their energy policy. What about environmental regulations more broadly? Do they have plans to roll back existing protections?
They do. They argue that the Environmental Protection Agency has become too powerful and that its regulations are stifling economic growth and innovation.
Mhm.
They want to significantly reduce the agency's authority and streamline the permitting process for industries like mining, logging, and oil and gas extraction.
It sounds like they're prioritizing short-term economic gains over the long-term health of the planet and the well-being of future generations.
That's a valid concern, and it's worth noting that this disdain for environmental regulations is often intertwined with a broader distrust of science and expertise, which is another hallmark of Christian nationalism and other populist movements.
It's like they're rejecting the idea that we need to rely on experts and scientific evidence to make sound policy decisions.
Exactly, and that can be a very dangerous road to go down.
Yeah.
When you start dismissing expertise and evidence, you open the door to all sorts of misinformation and conspiracy theories,
Right.
which can undermine public trust and erode the foundations of democracy.
It's a scary thought for sure, but it's also a reminder of why it's so important to stay informed and engaged. We can't just sit back and let these things happen without pushing back and demanding better from our leaders.
I couldn't agree more. An informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny, and it's our responsibility to hold our leaders accountable and demand policies that are based on evidence, reason, and compassion.
Well said. But before we get too carried away, let's get back to Project 2025. We've talked about their plans for the Justice Department, their energy and environmental policies, and their desire to reshape the education system. What other areas are they targeting?
One area that's particularly revealing is their approach to social welfare programs.
Okay.
They want to significantly reduce the size and scope of the welfare state, arguing that it creates dependency and discourages self-sufficiency.
Okay, so less government assistance and more emphasis on individual responsibility. We've heard that argument before from conservatives. What makes it uniquely concerning in this context?
It's the way they frame the issue that raises red flags. They repeatedly paint this picture of a society that's been corrupted by government handouts,
Okay.
and where people are being encouraged to rely on the state instead of on themselves and their families.
It sounds like they're trying to tap into a sense of resentment towards those who rely on social welfare programs, portraying them as lazy or undeserving.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that kind of rhetoric can be very effective in dividing people and undermining support for programs that are designed to help the most vulnerable members of society.
It's almost like they're trying to create a moral hierarchy where those who are self-sufficient and don't rely on government assistance are seen as more virtuous than those who do.
That's a perceptive observation, and it aligns with the Christian nationalist worldview,
Uh-huh.
which often emphasizes personal responsibility and traditional family structures, while casting suspicion on those who deviate from those norms.
So it's not just about cutting spending or shrinking the government. It's about promoting a very specific set of values and beliefs about what constitutes a good and moral citizen.
Precisely, and that's what makes Project 2025 so potentially transformative. It's not just about policy, it's about ideology and worldview.
It's a stark reminder that politics is never just about numbers or statistics. It's about values, beliefs, and the kind of society we want to create.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations and to understand the deeper implications of the choices we make as a society.
Well, this has been a fascinating and thought-provoking exploration of Project 2025's agenda and its potential connection to the rise of Christian neo-fascism. We've covered a lot of ground, but I know there's still much more to unpack. What are some of the other key takeaways from this document that listeners should be aware of?
One of the most striking things about Mandate for Leadership is its comprehensiveness. It's not just a set of policy proposals, it's a blueprint for a complete transformation of the American government and society.
So they're not just aiming to win elections. They're aiming to fundamentally change the way America is governed and the values it stands for.
Precisely, and that's why it's so crucial to understand their vision and the potential consequences of its realization.
So it's clear that Project 2025 has a really specific vision for America.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about how some of their ideas connect to these anxieties about Christian neo-fascism. But amid all these policy specifics, what's the big story they're trying to tell?
It's a very powerful narrative
Okay.
of decline and restoration.
Mm-hmm.
They're painting this picture of a once great nation
Right.
that's been corrupted by, liberal elites, globalist agendas, a rejection of traditional values.
Okay.
They argue that America has strayed from its Christian foundations and that its very identity is under threat.
So it's a classic us versus them narrative.
Yeah.
They identify an enemy,
Right.
they stoke fear and resentment,
Uh-huh.
and then they position themselves as the saviors who can restore America to its former glory.
Precisely. And that kind of narrative, as we've discussed,
Yeah.
can be incredibly effective in mobilizing support and justifying radical change,
Yeah.
especially in times of uncertainty and anxiety.
And they're not shy about who they see as the enemy.
No.
They're very clear about targeting what they call woke culture warriors,
Yeah.
secular humanists,
Yeah.
anyone else who challenges their worldview.
Right. And they argue that these groups have infiltrated America's institutions,
Hmm.
from education and media to government and the courts,
Right.
and that they're actively working to undermine traditional values and dismantle the nation's Christian heritage.
It's a pretty stark picture,
Yeah,
and one that's likely to resonate with people who feel like their way of life is under attack.
absolutely. And that's what makes Project 2025 so potentially dangerous. It's not just a set of policy proposals.
Right.
It's a movement
Yeah.
that seeks to redefine what it means to be an American.
And that definition seems to exclude anyone who doesn't fit into their narrow worldview.
That's a key takeaway here.
Hmm?
Their vision of a restored America is one that's built on a very specific interpretation of Christianity.
Okay.
And it leaves very little room for those who hold different beliefs or come from different backgrounds.
It's a vision that's fundamentally at odds with the idea of America as a pluralistic and inclusive society.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the implications of their agenda
Yeah.
and to engage in thoughtful and informed debate about the kind of future we want for our country.
Okay, so we've got this alarming narrative, this ambitious plan to reshape American society.
Uh-huh.
But how realistic is their vision? Do they actually have a chance of pulling this off?
Well, it's impossible to say for sure.
Right.
They certainly face significant obstacles.
Oh.
A deeply divided Congress, a robust civil society, a legal system that safeguards individual rights.
So it's not a foregone conclusion,
Right.
but it's also not something we can afford to ignore.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that even if they don't succeed in fully implementing their agenda,
Right.
their ideas and rhetoric can still have a profound impact on the political landscape and the direction of our country.
So we need to be vigilant, even if we're skeptical of their chances of success.
Exactly. And we need to be prepared to push back against their attempts to erode democratic norms and undermine the values of equality, justice, and freedom that America has always stood for.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's clear that Project 2025 represents a serious challenge to the kind of America many of us believe in.
You've summed it up perfectly. It's a wake-up call for anyone who cares about the future of our democracy and the well-being of all Americans, regardless of their beliefs or background.
So to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of Project 2025 and its potential connections to these anxieties about Christian neo-fascism.
And remember, an informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for the kind of America you want to live in.
And we'll leave you with this thought.
Yeah.
The future of our country is not predetermined. It's something that we create together through our choices and our actions. So be informed, be engaged, and be hopeful,